Hello, welcome to the therapy room. My name is Shea Marriott. I am the Director of Marketing and Business Relationships here at the Center for Child Development. And today I have the pleasure of introducing the owner, the founder, Miss Lisa Savage. Welcome to the therapy room, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Shay. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Yes, I'm so happy that you were able to make it. Monthly we come on and we talk about different topics that's going on in mental health that will be helpful for people. Today's topic is what is trauma? I was so happy that you agreed to come on and talk about trauma because it is so important that people understand what trauma is because we tend to normalize it a lot. So Lisa, what is trauma?
Yep. That's a very good question, Shay, because we hear that term a lot. And I think sometimes we think of it as being something really catastrophic, like a earthquake or a hurricane. But the definition, a psychological definition, is anything that overwhelms a person's ability to cope. I want to read a really good quote by Dr. Herman about trauma, because I thought this really summed it up. And what he says is, traumatic events occur when they overwhelm the ordinary systems of care that give people a sense of control, connection, and meaning. The severity of traumatic events cannot be measured on any single dimension. Simplistic efforts to quantify trauma ultimately lead to meaningless comparisons of horror. The salient characteristics of a traumatic event is its power to inspire helplessness and terror. Mm-hmm. So basically what I think he's saying is that we can't look at one person's trauma and say that's not traumatic and compare it to somebody else's trauma. Trauma is the event that overwhelms our body to cope. And when you're talking about children, of course, they're very vulnerable to things happening in their lives that overwhelm their ability to cope.
Right. Wow. So, how would you describe how trauma affects the body?
Yeah, and this is why I really like talking about this. So, several years ago, when I first started out as a therapist, I was working predominantly with women at the local healthcare system. And one thing that I noticed that was puzzling to me, now this was in the 90s, was that most of the women that came in for therapy had a chronic health condition. Mm-hmm. One had irritable bowel, I can remember, cancers, other stomach problems. And I was scratching my head going, this is weird, because the one thing they had in common was they all had really rough childhoods. Mm-hmm. So I mentioned it to a nurse practitioner at the time, and she said, you're probably right. There probably is some connection. Well, now, 2 decades later, we're realizing there really is a connection between chronic health conditions and the experience of trauma.
Yeah, definitely. When you talk about how it affects the body and stuff, I think about, some patients that, I have that may have constant migraines, constant head pain, the blood pressure, like you were saying, it's really, really important on, that what we're doing today in regards to understanding how trauma shows up. Because like I said earlier, we do tend to normalize it. And, having someone come in the office, and of course, one of our questions is, do you have a history of trauma? And a lot of people will say no, but you and I both know that pretty much everybody has some type of history of trauma.
Exactly.
But they've normalized it, right? Or they may say, well, it was just something that I went through, and downplay it. So, So why is this so importantly? So why us having this conversation about trauma? Why is this important? Why is this important to you?
So there was a study that was done in the 1990s. It was with Kaiser Permanente and the CDC. And what they did was they surveyed over 17,000 people in California, and they asked them certain questions. And the questions were about adverse childhood experiences, or otherwise known as ACEs. And so what they learned is that 7 out of 10 people who were part of that study had more than 4 ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. But even beyond that, those people who had 4 or more ACEs were more at risk for heart disease, cancer, lung disease, and it reduced their life expectancy by 20 years. By 20 years. So that's when it became important, when they did this study, that we really started educating people about what trauma looks like and how to prevent it in their children, but also how to resolve it in themselves. I'm going to give you some examples of trauma, excuse me, because I think our listening audience might be able to, it might resonate with them what some examples of trauma are. So abuse of any kind, neglect, a parent with a chronic mental health condition or substance abuse, poverty is very traumatic, food insecurity, parental incarceration, of course, natural disasters, the sudden or violent death of a loved one, living in a neighborhood where there is chronic violence, and then, of course, witnessing a war or genocide. So fortunately, in our country, we have not witnessed genocide, in the way that other countries have. But a lot of people deal with abuse, neglect, poverty, food insecurity, parents getting divorced, parents not being able to be emotionally available to their children. And so those are some of the things that we count as potentially traumatic. Now, does everybody who endures a divorce as a child, if their parents go through a divorce, do they all suffer from the negative impact of trauma? No, they do not. Because what makes a difference is a caring adult.
Right.
So if a child is going through, let's say, divorce, for example, but their parents are caring and nurturing and reassuring, that's going to mitigate the effects of that trauma on that child. So we may have people listening saying, I went through that, but I turned it okay. Well, perhaps they had parents who were nurturing and loving and caring and warm and put the kids' needs first. But some parents aren't able to do that, if we're using this as an example. So some of these things that our listening audience may have experienced in their lives, they might want to go back and say, am I still impacted by this trauma? Because even though the trauma is over, the sense of security within the person's experience has been shaken. And that can cause a whole lot of other issues, which we'll get to later on in the interview.
Yeah. Wow. And yeah, absolutely. Because a person can, not feel safe mentally, not feel
Correct.
all of
That's
those
right.
things. So it definitely shows up.
That's right.
Lisa, what are some things that could be helpful for someone that is dealing with trauma?
Yeah. So let's talk about how trauma impacts us physically, psychologically, and then what we could do about it. So what happens is there is a system in our brain called the HPA. So the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and then the adrenal system. So when a person is under threat, the hypothalamus sends a signal to the pituitary glands. The pituitary gland sends a signal to the adrenal glands, which the adrenal glands are the glands that are responsible for cortisol, blood sugar, adrenaline. And so those hormones start to emit in our body. We need them because I always use the example, if you walk out of your house and there's a pit bull charging you.
I use the same one. Use the same example.
And that pit bull has his teeth bared and he looks like he's going to pounce on you. Guess what? You need that HPA system to kick in. You need the adrenaline, the cortisol, so you can save yourself. So you go into fight or flight.
Right.
Most of us are going to go into that fight mode, but some people go into the flee mode as well, where they run from the situation. And we need that energy so that we can save ourselves.
Yes.
The problem is, if that HPA system is on high activation, high alert all of the time, those chemicals that are being emitted and hormones cause psychological problems and physical problems because they're constantly being activated. I remember a few years ago, I was dealing with a lot of stress. I was moving and I went to the doctor. She did some blood work and my cortisol level was really high. But that's why, because I was under that stress. So if you are working with children, for example, who have difficulty expressing their emotions or difficulty concentrating or difficulty with impulse control, a lot of times we will go in and say, oh, this child has ADHD, because that's kind of like the term that we use, or the diagnosis that we use. However, most skilled and experienced therapists are going to go back and dig into that child's history to see if that child has any trauma. Because the symptoms of ADHD, anxiety, often can mimic, trauma can mimic those symptoms. And so we need to go back and look in the history to see if perhaps there's trauma that has not been treated that causes this child to be in the constant fight or flight mode. And we see that a lot with kids that we work with in the schools. And so there's a big effort to educate teachers about how to respond to children who are in the fight or flight mode, and certainly with parents as well. Children don't realize they're in a fight or flight mode. Their brains do. And so some things that we can do as adults to help us lessen the impact of trauma on ourselves, obviously therapy. Therapy provides a safe, nurturing, non-judgmental space for people to process their trauma. And if you're not feeling safe and nurtured by your therapist, then you have the wrong therapist.
Right,
so you need to find somebody else who can provide you with that safe space. Because safety, security, and nurturance is really the healing power for trauma.
Yes.
And I'm not saying that that's the only thing, especially in adults, because we've lived with years of trauma, so we may need more things. But with children, a consistent, nurturing, warm, attached adult, that really is very helpful. The other things that I like to do with clients as well is breath work, so deep breathing, because that calms down the nervous system.
Yes.
Meditation also brings the nervous system down and helps to reestablish some equilibrium. Yoga is very good because it's body work. A lot of times our emotions are stored in our body and we don't even realize it.
Right.
So yoga helps to put us more in touch with our body, to feel safe within our body, because some people who've experienced trauma don't feel safe in their bodies. And so yoga helps to make that connection back to our bodies and help us to feel safe within our bodies as well. Exercise is a big one.
Yes.
Exercise brings down those cortisol levels and the adrenaline levels. So exercise is good. And if exercise is not accessible to a person, just simple stretching can help as well, release those chemicals from the muscles. We do a form of therapy at the Center for Child Development called EMDR, and EMDR stands for eye movement reprocessing desensitization. And so it helps the brain to better integrate the trauma, because while the trauma has passed, the memories of it, what we call implicit memories, are kind of hanging out in the back of our mind, unfiled. So EMDR, in a sense, helps us to file those traumatic memories so they're not continuing to trigger that fight or flight response. EMDR is great, very effective for people with anxiety, depression, PTSD. You can do EMDR on infants all the way up to adulthood, including adulthood. Brain spotting, which is a very specialized form of trauma treatment is also very effective. There are some specific trauma treatments that we do with children, like TFCBT, which stands for trauma focused CBT therapy, helping people to feel more comfortable in their bodies, helping people to understand where they're feeling their trauma in their bodies is something else that therapists can do to help people to process and resolve their trauma.
Yes, and the great thing about this, all these modalities that you just mentioned, we offer here at the Center for Child Development.
We
So
do.
that's
We
exciting.
do. Yes,
It's a
we do.
one-stop shop.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm very proud that we have the most EMDR trained therapists in the
Yes.
state. Most of our therapists are trained in EMDR. And the reason I'm proud about that is because we can create more healing, right? So we work with people from the northern part of Delaware all the way down to the beach. And most of our therapists, I would say 90% of them are trained or going to be trained. So we can create more healing in people. We know what it takes to help a person to be less fight or flight and more even, more calm, and kind of process that trauma so it doesn't have that negative impact on them. I'm a firm believer in the mind and body connection. I know you are as well, Shea. And so when I'm talking with people with chronic ailments, I'm always mindful that there's something else that is unresolved in that person's life.
Yes.
That is continuing to impact their body in a negative way.
Yes, absolutely. This is really good information, and I really believe that someone that is watching it's helping. It's helping them to understand what trauma is and what's going on. And hopefully it's encouraging someone to reach out and get therapy. So if you are looking for therapy, please reach out to the Center for Child Development and Delaware Center for Counseling and Wellness at 302-292-1334. We accept most insurance. Also, you can go to our website at centerforchilddevelopment.com, and you can fill out a consent form right online, and we will definitely get you assigned to a therapist. And there's no wait. There's no wait. So a lot of places there's a wait line. There is no wait list for us. So, just take the jump and reach out for therapy. Lisa, is there anything else you would like to share with us before we wrap up?
Yeah, so how I'd like to leave this conversation is for any parents who are listening who may feel like they have unresolved trauma. Resolving your trauma is important for your child's mental and physical well-being as well.
Yes.
We know that trauma can be passed on from generation to generation. And so if a parent is listening and thinking, wow, I've been through some of those adverse childhood experiences, it's really important for you to seek your own treatment so that your child has a better chance and the next generation does as well. We see adults in our practice as well. People sometimes don't know that because of the name, but we do see quite a few adults actually. At this point, Shea and I only work with adults. So we don't want you to, if you need the help and you're thinking, I got to go find somebody, well, guess what? We do see quite a few adults at this point. So that's how I'd like to leave, and I appreciate the opportunity, any opportunity that I can have to come and talk about trauma and give people some hope that they too can recover.
Absolutely. Thank you so much again for your time, because I know you are a very busy woman. So thank you everybody for joining the therapy room today. The therapy room has been brought to you by the Center for Child Development and Delaware Center for Counseling and Wellness. Again, please, let's start normalizing therapy. Give us a call, 302-292-1334. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks, Lisa.
You're welcome.